is a comment form for the conference. We would really appreciate it if you would fill it out as you leave. If you're staying for all the sessions, you can do it at the end, but if you only have time to drop in for one or more sessions, when you leave, please fill that in and put it in the inbox that's out on that table. It's really useful to us to know what has worked well, what you might change, and also to the Rock Ethics Institute. And for those who are at Penn State, there is also a Rock Ethics Institute sign-up sheet. This is just one of a number of really terrific conferences that the Rock puts on, so it'd be good to get on their mailing list. So the topic of this session is critical approaches to Alzheimer's disease. And our speakers, in the order that they are going to speak, are Peter Whitehouse at Case Western Reserve University. And let me just tell you a little bit about Peter. Those of you who were at the lobby talk last night know this already, and many others do as well. But Peter is a professor of neurology, psychiatry, neuroscience, psychology, nursing, organizational behavior, cognitive science, and history. I love that list. At Case Western Reserve University, he's a geriatric neurologist, cognitive neuroscience scientist, and global bioethicist. And there are many more things I could tell you about him, but I think I will stop there. And and I should say also he's doing NIH-funded research on the quality of life, ethics, intervention trials, and genetic testing in dementia. Our next speaker will be Woody Gaines, also Case Western Reserve University, and he's a professor of anthropology, bioethics, nursing, and psychiatry, and he's also on the program faculty in ethnic studies and women's studies. And then the third speaker will be Stephen Katz, who's a professor of sociology at Trent University in Canada, and Stephen's research focuses on aging, critical gerontology, sociology of the body, cultural expertise, and the risk society. And he's the author of Disciplining Old Age and of Cultural Aging, and contributor to many other collections of essays. So please welcome the panelists, and we look forward to the session.
Thanks, Susan, and it's such a pleasure to be here. It's been so much fun already, and to have 2 more days ahead of us is just delicious. I want to recognize Danny George. Danny is sick. He got the same virus that's been going around our group, and he actually got in the car with his dad last night to try to drive here with his dad driving, and they decided not to come. So wisely, I think, from both public health and a personal his perspective. Danny is a student at Oxford in medical anthropology. He is AVD, and was very much looking forward to meeting all the medical anthropologists that are here, as well as the rest of us. So I'll feature some of his work as we go along, culminating in a book that we've done together called The Myth of Alzheimer's Disease. I want to begin by declaring war. I am a neurologist, and we, particularly neurologists, like men, and we're aggressive. We're going to go out there and we're going to get Alzheimer's disease before it gets to baby boomers, right? But we got to identify our enemy. So what is the enemy? What are we fighting here? Well, we are fighting the most common cause of age-related progressive loss of cognitive abilities. We are fighting the death of nerve cells caused by these awful things that Dr. Alzheimer put together into some kind of package. A package he himself wasn't sure what he put together. Plaques and tangles 100 years ago. We are fighting a global war because this is not so much a problem. It's a greater problem in other countries, particularly China and India, where they are aging at a more rapid rate and projecting huge numbers of people affected by this awful enemy of ours, Alzheimer's disease. Now, we're fortunate to have some really powerful approaches and some really wonderful fathers of history. I'm sorry to use that, but that's I'm a neurologist. This is Theodore Miner. This guy practiced at the turn of the century and taught Sigmund Freud neuroanatomy. He also described the nucleus basalis of Minot. Part of my research enterprise was to understand it a bit better, and it was renamed the cholinergic basal forebrain. these purple objects in that slide are neurons stained with a Nissl stain. Nissl was one of Alzheimer's friends, and one of the reasons for his success, Alzheimer's success, was that they could understand the brain because they could stain these neurons and understand the structure of the brain. And so this is what we found happen in Alzheimer's. This is normal, whatever that means, and this is actually a young age with our first case, a woman in her 50s. Even without a training in neuropathology, you can see that there are fewer neurons in the lower picture. So we now know that something that Miner didn't, which is the neurotransmitter associated with these basal forebrain or nucleus basalis minors are in fact acetylcholine. We know more than that. We know now molecularly that the major receptor change. Now, receptors were also described at the turn of the century. All neurotransmitters stimulate receptors of one kind or another. And we know from work again I did at Hopkins with colleagues that if this is normal and this is Alzheimer's, the nicotinic receptors, the nicotinic cholinergic receptors, a particular subtype of receptor are affected. And now we know a lot about the nicotinic receptor. We know its pentameric structure. We know its components. And of course, in this war, we have powerful molecular, biological, and high-throughput screening and drug modeling so that we can get at these therapeutic nicotinic receptors in the brain, the alpha-4s, the beta-2s, and we can avoid side effects by making our agents more selective. This is the powerful technology that we have in this war, which includes a whole lot of scientific techniques that have been developed during our lifetime and before that allow us to understand specific genetic abnormalities and their consequences on brain tissue. It is an exciting story. And it's just in time that we declare war on this disease because you have heard that there is now a new face of Alzheimer's disease. Why more younger people than ever are falling prey to this devastating disease. What you can do, and the push for a cure from U.S. News and World Report just a few months ago. Of course, the only reason that there are more baby boomers affected by it is that there are more baby boomers in general. But this is part of the extension of the war now. Baby boomers have to be concerned not only about preventing it, but by getting it themselves. Now, we've begun an exploration, though. We didn't wait for the 100th anniversary. This is Alzheimer's family house over here. Jesse and I, with the man who found the first case, the professor of psychiatry in Frankfurt, Konrad Maurer, and I organized a conference called Concepts of Alzheimer's Disease, published in a Hopkins book, Biological, Clinical, and Cultural Perspectives. And this was a wonderful conference, very small number of people, Germans, molecular biologists, Italians, advocates of Perezzini, anatomists, and it was supported by Lilly. So here we have ethicists and historians flying in the Lilly corporate jet. I want you to know that is a high point of my career. And Lilly actually, I don't think they read the book because they actually bought free copies and distributed it. So the war is now extending itself to an exploration that continues in Jesse's great conference you put together today. Now, what are some of the key issues, the key concepts that I think we need to consider that puzzle us today? They puzzle Alzheimer's Kreplin, but what are they? Well, the first I'm going to introduce to you is the concept of mild cognitive impairment. Mild cognitive impairment was developed and promoted largely by the Mayo Clinic, and particularly by a man by the name of Ron Peterson, who I count as a friend, even though we are, shall I say, not on the same side of the issue. I hate these things.
Go forward, and then when we go back.
So, mild cognitive impairment as the...
Escape.
Now let's make go back.
I don't think you can.
No, it's just really got to reprogram it. All right. The moral of this is I cannot go backward in this talk. We can only go forward. So this is the concept of mild cognitive impairment. In the words of Ron, it's a state of cognition and functionality between normal aging and very mild Alzheimer's disease. It's a concept that started because of the obvious recognition that people who don't have enough cognitive impairment to have significant disability in the way of activities of daily living still may have cognitive problems. There have been many, many labels applied to this pre-Alzheimer's or pre-dementia state. My favorite still is Crowell's, which is benign senile forgetfulness. But this is the extension of the boundaries of the medicalization of aging. This I took quickly with my digital camera when Ron's colleagues were giving a talk in Minnesota. Here we have normal, no symptoms. Here we have Alzheimer's. Here we have the mild cognitive impairment diagnosis. Now, some people don't think it's a diagnosis yet, but it's legitimate because we now have pre-mild cognitive impairment. And of course, there's pre-mild cognitive impairment, or as I've suggested, we call pre-mild cognitive impairment Peterson's syndrome. So labels are a nightmare, but this is data. This is to me the most fundamental lesson of what we've learned in Alzheimer's disease in the last 100 years. And I think this is just data from about 25 patients in our center, but I could show you data from any one of the centers that would make the same lesson. If, when people come into our research study, they are labeled as normal, mild cognitive impairment, or Alzheimer's disease, so this is the mini-mental. So this is 29, this is 28, this is 22, arbitrary set start points. But look, the variation in the trajectory of those folks. So the main lesson at a molecular, a genetic, a biological, a clinical, is that Alzheimer's disease is heterogeneous. Why is it heterogeneous? Because it reflects, to my opinion, the brain aging of different people. So if you've seen one person with Alzheimer's disease, you have seen one person with Alzheimer's disease. You've seen one particular profile of activity. So this is an interesting book that Jesse quotes in his book. Beyond the thin line, there's a thin line between being normal and being mild cognitive impairment or demented. And how do we draw that line? So one of the things that I think has caused me to reflect on what we mean by Alzheimer's disease is this proliferation of labeling. The other is, and Arthur Kleinman came to our place and said something that I quote him publicly, I might as well do it here since he's here, that and I may misquote him that he's here, correct me, that the conflict of interest between the medical professional and the pharmaceutical industry is the greatest moral crisis facing medicine. And if I didn't get it quite right, it's certainly he's going around saying it is the great moral dilemma for medicine. Jerry Sierra, who was at our place for a while, writes about on the take how medicine's complicity with big business can endanger health. I think one of Arthur's graduate students just wrote a book describing by numbers about how the drug industry have tried to make us think that our health is completely determined by our blood pressure, our cholesterol, or other factors. So I think we are overdosed in America. I think we let the pharmaceutical companies tell the stories about what health is in this country far too strongly. So to just move to the second phase of the talk, where Danny would kind of engage you a bit more, I will share 4 patient stories. I want to first say that I really think that narrative, as a neurologist, plays a really important part in our mental functions and our brain functions. Mark Turner, who's a friend in our cognitive science department, wrote a book called The Literary Mind. Most of our knowledge and thinking is organized in story form. The narrative imagination has a lot to do, as you heard in the early talks, particularly from Jesse, about defining the very nature of ourselves as people. So the stories we tell, and the metaphors tell about in our stories powerfully affect the stories we can tell. That's why I gave you the war story in the very beginning, the story that I participated in, that medicine is forever declaring wars on cancers and Alzheimer's disease and everything else. So I think this audience is well aware that we live by metaphors embedded in our stories. And so here are some of the metaphors you've already heard from Jesse. It's the never-ending funeral, it's a second childhood, it's a living death, it's a loss of self. These are all metaphorical to one degree or another and frame how we can think about dementia. So let me share 4 stories quickly, and I actually didn't set my watch, so would you just tell me how much you have? 10 minutes for 4 stories, because obviously stories can go on to varying degrees. So Thomas DiBaggio will tell us something about labeling. Mary Atwood, something about therapy. Ann Davidson, something about relationship. And Barney Ness, the lacer, something about philosophy. Thomas DiBaggio is maybe well known to you. He actually was already mentioned here in Jesse's talk, I think. Mr. DiBaggio is a herbalist who lived in Washington and started forgetting the name of the 50,000 herbs that he sold, something I'm sure I could never accomplish. A very bright, articulate man who's written 3 books about his Alzheimer's disease. The first, which for a time was competing with the 36-hour day on Amazon, was called Losing My Mind, An Intimate Look at Life with Alzheimer's. And his second was also published, and his third was not published, for which he is somewhat disappointed. But that's a remarkable accomplishment, to write 3 books about your Alzheimer's. So Ann and I went and visited him. That's Ann Bastings, who you'll be hearing from later. And we chatted with him for about an hour in a hotel in Washington when the GSA was going on. It was a really enjoyable conversation. He was quite articulate. And I was beginning to try to figure out what kind of an Alzheimer's was his story. And so Ann was talking to him about his authorship, being an author, being a public figure. And he is a public figure. He's not my patient. And I don't want to discredit him in any way. I wanted to say he was told that he had mild cognitive impairment leading to Alzheimer's disease. And that first book is all about the fear and terror of falling off the abyss, of being essentially destroyed, losing his mind, as you can see. But after having this conversation, and now this is after having written 2 books, I asked him to remember 2 words, and he couldn't in a very short period of time. This is not typical Alzheimer's. This is not. This may be his Alzheimer's. It may be his label. But as a neurologist, I can say that if he came into my office, I would not have diagnosed Alzheimer's disease. I probably wouldn't even have labeled mild cognitive impairment. He had an abnormal pattern, which I am not going to interpret, although there are some dimensions to that one might imagine. Might imagine for those of you that can imagine having an intelligent conversation with somebody and then give him a couple of words to remember, and he couldn't remember those words over a very short period of time. That's inconsistent with that. So there's an inconsistency to his exam. So to me, he is an example of a situation where somebody is terrified by the label, first mild cognitive impairment, and then the question about whether it led to Alzheimer's. To contextualize the second story, that story was about labeling and the power of labeling. By the way, there's now an organization called the Dementia Advocacy Support Network International, organized and led internationally by people with frontal lobe dementia, executive dysfunction. On one level, that's a tremendous credit, but I can assure you there are people running around that organization that I don't believe have dementia. So in this space we've created for the early recognition of dementia are emerging some people with some interesting phenomenology. Mrs. Atwood, and I use all these photographs and all these names either because they're public figures or with their permission, is a volunteer in an intergenerational school that my wife and I started, where 100 African-American children from Cleveland interact with older adults in various programs. Our signature program is at Fair Hill Center, which is an old Merchant Marine hospital where our research programs are for dementia, as well as my clinic. This is Mrs. Atwood. Mrs. Atwood has 2 sisters in a nursing home with a diagnosis of Alzheimer's disease, and she has also been diagnosed as Alzheimer's disease. But been coming to the school for 3 years. She reads to those children, and she structures her Thursdays around this event in the school. In fact, this event structures her Wednesdays as she prepares, and her Fridays as she shares the positive stories of sharing storytelling with children. So Mrs. Atwood is an illustration of where I think we should be going therapeutically for people with age-related cognitive challenges like the label Alzheimer's disease, which is not necessarily just a biological approach, but a integrated program that provides them a sense of purpose, a sense of community, and a sense of keeping their lifelong learning going. I sometimes describe this object here as a multi-neurotransmitter lexical enhancement device, formerly known as a book. And I assure you that if I did a PET scan on Mrs. Atwood before and after reading a book, you would see some areas of the brain light up. Reading books affects the brain. Wow. The next context is the conference we did in Cleveland. This was kind of our sister conference. Jesse and Ann and some of the other folks were in Cleveland for a conference we called Reflecting on 100 Years of Alzheimer's, the Global Impact and Quality of Lives. And of course, I should also mention my fellow case colleague Woody was there. So we had a few hundred people listening to a variety of stories, and the story I quickly want to share, and then story number 3, is Ann Davidson. Ann Davidson is a speech pathologist, and her husband, Julian Stanley, was an endocrinologist at Stanford. And as you can see, she wrote a story about 1 year's journey in her husband's career. Now, I don't think I caught Jesse Ballinger crying, but I can tell you that when Ann shared this story in Cleveland, were you crying? I was crying. Ann described how she decided to go down with dementia, but in love. And the thing that I really love is the story she tells about how she convinced her publisher to juxtapose the title Alzheimer's with a love story. Because you've seen titles of other books, they're all negative. Ann maintained her humanity, her husband's humanity, in the context of addressing this particular label that was applied to her husband. Finally, I'm going to end with Barney Ness. Barney Ness is a Norwegian hero. For those of you that are philosophers, it's unusual for a philosopher to be a hero in a country, but Barney was the youngest philosophy professor at the University of Norway at the age of 17, and also a mountain climber, and also remembered when he locked himself out of the office for climbing up the university building to get to his office. He also had a shack, kind of like Aldo Leopold, for some of you know him, in a mountainous area of Norway that I happened to be able to photograph as I was passing by in a train. I never made it to his shack somewhere up there. But here we are overlooking Norway, overlooking Oslo, with my friend, an occupational therapist, talking to Arnie about his dementia. Arnie could not tie his shoelaces, but Arnie could still talk about deep ecology. He could still talk about his philosophies of engagement with the natural world that had a profound spiritual dimension. For those of you that are interested, and I know the Rock Ethics Institute here does a lot of work here in environmental ethics, you will know the name of Arnie Ness because of his focus on deep ecology. Arnie used the metaphor that we need to learn to think like a mountain, and he could still express that. When he looked out from that restaurant over the harbor of Oslo, you could see him thinking about the beauty and position in relationship to the mountain that I guess you could say we were on. So what does it mean to think like a mountain? Obviously, this is the metaphor I'm ending with. Mountains have a long duration, but they do change. You could say, if you're associated with mountains, you think about peak experiences. You also think about the deep-rooted connectedness with mountains and the planet Earth. So you can see why a deep ecologist might imagine thinking like a mountain. So here I was, having sought out this man in Norway, to only learn that he is himself actually now in a nursing home dealing with what we might call Alzheimer's. So how would he and what would a mountain think about Alzheimer's disease, metaphorically? Well, I'm going to say to you, to summarize, Alzheimer's is not one thing. There's a heterogeneity there that we have not begun to fully appreciate. And so we are in a situation where we're trying to not find a cure, if you want to say that. We are declaring war on multiple things. Why does this sound familiar? We have a tendency to declare wars on complicated things. In fact, I would actually draw the parallel, although my publisher says to be careful about this, there's something akin to the war on terrorism.
Yes.
I mean, that is, to my mind, such a nonsensical thing to declare war on. Well, I don't want to exactly say that Alzheimer's is akin to terrorism, but I will say that we are terrorized by Alzheimer's disease as well, so there's a thought there. The other thing I would say is it's not fundamentally different than brain aging. There's an overlap here that's tremendous, which is why I think we have to be very careful about leaving the normal in one category and putting the Alzheimer's over here in another category. And this, when I presented this in Berlin at the Alzheimer's Disease International meeting, drew severe critique from our friend Ben Finblad. He said, you cannot go around the world saying that Alzheimer's disease is a disease of the mind more than the brain. Well, obviously I do believe that the mind and brain are connected, but I think we need to think of Alzheimer's disease as a two-word eponym. It is a mental construct. I will say to you, in my opinion, all diseases are socially constructed and all diseases have a biology. Let's not get into that fight. But let's recognize that everything we label in this world, we label with purpose and intent and politics and relations. And this is a time to think about what it might mean to say that Alzheimer's is a disease of the mind. In other words, a disease of our own cognitive and emotional apparatus more than the brain. So I'm going to say to you, are you going to tell your story of Alzheimer's, or is Alzheimer's going to tell your story? It's time to talk back and move forward, and that's a plug for Anne's film tonight, which you've got to come and see. It's great. And also a plug, don't look for this cover on your bookstores yet, that's the fake cover, but that's The Myth of Alzheimer's Disease by Whitehouse and George, forthcoming this fall from St. Martin's Press. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Woody Gaines. I'd like to thank the conference organizers for this wonderful production, a production of which we get to see all of our friends again. Do serious academic work, sorry. That contrast I just did, I'll be taking up in this paper, which is sort of not a paper, I didn't know I was giving it today. My title is Losing the Selves, and it's plural because my concern here is to raise three moral issues in the language and research and thinking about Alzheimer's disease, and they're grounded in a particular cultural ideology. So in saying losing the selves, I'm arguing that there are different kinds of selves that might be affected or lost or not lost when afflicted with various forms of dementia, or as I've come to view them along with Peter, as brain aging rather than a particular disease process, and the process which many people are considering today, the construction of Alzheimer's disease, as something, as we titled in a recent paper, building a mystery. 100 years of building something and we're still not sure what it is. I also always like to use music song titles. So that's Sarah McLaughlin's song Building a Mystery, and as Anne was talking about what song will she hear when she's old that will evoke memories, Building a Mystery, but more likely Eric Clapton songs will do it for me. Now, what's the problem with the discourse on AD and discourse of the self underline, and AD? The problems I see are that it is referring to a particular cultural self. And I would argue, and have argued in print many moons ago, that there are in fact two general cultural selves in the West. In particular, as I've written in an article actually that Arthur reviewed us as being written, he probably doesn't remember that, but Cultural Deafness and Behavior and the Person, in his book series, Culture, Illness, and Healing, that I distinguish Northern European Protestant culture and Mediterranean culture. And the two traditions have come, of course, to the United States. But each of those great traditions, in the Robert Redfield sense, have particular cultural selves. To specify further, the self of Northern European Protestantism, which comes to be the dominant self in the Western world, is not the majority self. And further, it is represents, as Max Weber said, a disenchantment, or the Protestant Reformation, which builds it, represents a disenchantment in the worldview of certain Europeans. So that's the disenchanted self that becomes the Protestant self. And this is the self that Geertz has described as being a center of emotion and cognition and action, an autonomous self that is set apart and opposed to other selves in a social world. In his classic article on the self that sort of begins the self literature in anthropology. Although I also refer to Dorothy Lee's work in the 50s and A.I. Hallowell's work on the self in the 50s. So this self that people talk about is the self of the dominant culture, but it is not the self of all Europeans. In fact, I would argue that the dominant culture, the Northern European Protestantism, is not a majority culture. And the first moral issue to be raised then is that the use of a notion of a majority mainstream American view of self in affliction is actually based on an implicit racial ideology. It's essentially saying that there's one cultural notion of self among white people and another for other people. My two distinctions, which I'll get into further, the referential and indexical self, referential self being that of Northern European Protestant, the great tradition born of the Protestant Reformation, and then the indexical self in the Mediterranean tradition, which indexes particular encounters, but as Dorothy Lee says, the idea is that one paints a picture of oneself. The actual details are far too boring. So it's a creative expression of self rather than a literal interpretation of the self. Now, in these two notions of self, in the United States, we say that there is just one, and therefore we have allegedly a single dominant cultural discourse, and then those minorities that are in the way and different somehow. Now, this problem is that it does actually bespeak a racial ideology that those who are white have a particular culture. And the first problem is there's no such thing as race, and second, races don't have cultures. And you could say add not a moral issue, but the factual issue that cultures don't come in colors. So with these two different notions of self, we have different characteristics. A key aspect which Jess raised is that the self of the dominant culture, which I would argue is a minority culture in the United States. It is the dominant one, but it is a minority culture. And so, in fact, culturally speaking, which anthropologists should always be doing, suggests that that cultural perspective means that all people in the United States are members of a minority group. There are no majority groups in the United States. So saying there's a majority group is invoking racial ideology, which is morally questionable, I would argue. Now, with these notions of self, they have, as I said, different characteristics. And the characteristics of the referential self, as I argue, Mediterranean self, are what I would say is more about being expressive, more about being communal, more about being familial, rather than the isolated, autonomous individual, which is also the basis for nursing home care, medical care, your own room with your own staff, the notions of efficiency, Ben Franklin's idea of time is money, so everything is efficient and so forth. So it is time for something rather than I feel like something. That's the difference in the two traditions. So these two, indexical referential, have been picked up by psychologists, and wouldn't you know it, that the psychologists usually say that the indexical person is the personhood of white people, and that all minorities in the United States have the referential, the indexical, and then white people have the referential. So in fact, they took the terms, said those are good, and immediately turned them into racial terms. And then, of course, homogenize all the quote-unquote racial groups. All those minority people are all the same. So the two traditions then, which I can't go into in great detail because it would take too long, and because I don't have those papers with me, carry different ideologies about self and self-making. An important issue for the referential person is that the self is referred to in interactions is always the same. It is created, but it is also a self-creation. so that the person is making him or herself through effort. And this produces another moral discourse, because the person who does not extend effort to make him or herself is morally lacking. So the notion of self-control includes this self-making. So if we look at the New York Times, we find a list of books, in the most read books, of self-help books, because people are making themselves. The first examples, actually, that I ever heard about Alzheimer's and dementia, and which piqued my interest and led to my running into Peter Whitehouse, was my school of Alzheimer's, you might say, is a comment by a neurologist who said that he had people from the eastern suburbs of Cleveland, Shaker Heights and so forth, which are largely the Protestants I'm talking about, the European Protestants. They would bring in Grandpa because he took 30 seconds longer to do the New York Times crossword puzzle than usual. And they were deeply concerned that there was something wrong. And examinations produced no differential results. And if any ever showed up, they would be years later. But they had Grampy in there when it took 30 seconds longer to do the New York Times puzzle. Now this self, in its self-making, also has the weird presumption that while the rest of the body may age, the brain somehow isn't supposed to. And it's partly because the essence is the brain, is the mind. And so it's really not important the other parts go, but there's a refusal to recognize that the mind must also go. Just as the knees go at 40 or so, you're not out there playing squash anymore, the knees get wobbly. The hips go, the eyes go, we were all wearing glasses and so forth. But somehow we think the brain does not age. As Thomas Kirkwood, in the response to our paper in PPP, pointed out that indeed the brain, like any other organ, must age. And there are particular characteristics of it. So we pathologize this because it is the essence of the self, the notion of the self. That notion is not. Oh, then the other half of the story of the neurologist is that on the other hand, people come from the west side, which is largely Slavic, and from the Huff, which is largely African American, with relatives who they say, well, we think something's wrong with Grandma or Grandpa. And Grandma and Grandpa are examined, and they don't know what decade it is. They don't know who the president is. They're not 100% sure what state they're in. But the family's just noticed that something might be wrong. In many of these contexts, they actually referred to that as they didn't think anything was wrong. It's just Alzheimer's disease. Well, not quite. But so there's great disparity in expectations. Now, there are also social expectations in that the indexical self, I would argue, is not, in fact, a psychology. It's a social psychology. So that the self is also other people. In analytic terms, we'd say that the ego boundaries are drawn not around just the physical body, but around the family, the body family, you might say. And so that which happens to the family happens to the self. That which happens to the self happens to the family, because they are the same psychological entity. And you see lots of cultural artifacts with respect to this. In France, where I've done a lot of research, people historically would, if asked their name, would give you their last name first, and then their first name, like the famous film Lacombe, Lucien, because who you are is Lacombe. Lucien is just a minor variation. Okay, so the family comes first, and the individual is an expression of it. A Chinese psychiatrist in Hawaii, Jing Shu, said, I'm talking about one person, and she raised her finger like this, and she said, he said, now you as an American, or as I say, Usonian, because America, everyone in the New World is an American, and we're really just in the United States, as a Usonian, you see this finger and it's floating in the air by itself, unconnected to anything. But when I raise my finger, I am well aware that it is connected to a hand, that is to say, to other people, and it is part and parcel of those other people. It is not autonomous and individual. It's part of a larger whole. Okay? So and this notion of self and family as being a single psychological unit is actually also behind the retribution policies of the Mafia. And why, if you're in the Mafia, you have to be a made man. You have to be Italian on both sides, and the reason is they want to be able to get all kinds of people if you make a mistake. Okay, so that they will do away with some relative of yours whom you may not have seen in 15 years if you do something wrong. In fact, I was talking about this in class one day, and in New York, a school teacher was gunned down in front of her school. People had no idea, what in the world is this? Why would a school teacher, it seemed like a gangland hit, she's murdered in front of her students? This is about 10 years ago. And after a week or so of investigation, they discovered that her brother, whom she had not spoken to in 15 years, was in fact in the Mafia and had stolen money. And they had chosen her to kill. And she was uninvolved in the Mafia. She was uninvolved with her brother's life. Hadn't seen him. She knew he was in the Mafia, which is why she didn't talk to him. But that person is part of him. And so they can get anyone. So it's part of a wider sense of self. So as I say, it's really a social psychology. And in the anthropological literature, we talk about notions of familism in the Mediterranean and notions of honor and shame and so forth, and various characteristics that have some value and not some other value. But they do emphasize a great difference from the notion of the self as self-constructed product of one's own effort. And I also have to emphasize that self is seen as a product, and the idea that you build yourself, that is, the effort is important, the control that the effort takes is important, and the fact that it is a product is important. Now, the bad thing about Alzheimer's disease is that it is an involuntary, that is, it's against self and control. It is an involuntary, seen as an involuntary unmaking of the self. So that while the rest of the body may be in great shape, the fact that the mind is going is highly problematic, as in the case of Janet Atkinson. She thought she had Alzheimer's, and so she had to work and help her do away with herself, even though, as people have said, it's a problematic diagnosis. But it was the fear that the mind was going, even if the rest of the body was fine, that was the essence of the self, was the mind was going. So those who are not, this is another moral issues, who are not making themselves, they are not expending effort, which is morally abhorrent. They are not producing something, which is morally abhorrent as well. So this cultural self then has a theory about other selves. Those that are unmade or unmaking are equally bad. And so in Germany, those that are retarded, those that are severely retarded, those who are mentally ill, and those with dementia were seen as expendable, and under the Nazi programs, killed. So the final solution was in fact practiced on German citizens before it was used on the Jews, and they were people who were mentally retarded and mentally ill and demented. So we have this notion that they are useless, and we see that reflected in Jesse's presentation, that people who are not productive, I think the original production is the self, but who are not productive of other things or can't be as productive, should be thrown in the scrap heap. Then it was at 40, which I don't think any of the contributors would be here now. But so that the age changes, but still the notion of the uselessness of a certain age is highlighted. I would also say that the notion that Martin Luther promulgated, which led to the development of notions of the profession, is that unlike in the Mediterranean tradition where there was God's work and man's work, there were separate domains, the Protestant Reformation argued that all work was God's work if it was done well. So this led to the notion of professionalizing and doing things well. And he actually said, even washing dishes. So if it's done well, then it's God's work. but it also means that there is no difference between God's world and the human world. So you have a Unitarian view of the world. So there is no need to go from one domain, the Durkheimian domains of the sacred and the profane. There's no need to cross those domains because it's all one thing. In the Latin traditions and Islamic traditions, they are separate. So what we have then is the presence in the United States of many people, I would say, are the Mediterranean tradition, who have what I would call the enchanted worldview, the opposite of the disenchanted worldview that was occasioned by the Protestant Reformation. And the enchanted has been less developed, but excellent book by Carolee Erickson, a historian, called The Medieval Vision, is an explication of the notion of the enchanted worldview. This worldview has within it a belief in what you might call magic. And a couple of days ago I heard a statistic which indicated that 69% of Americans believe in miracles. And not that, gee, I won the lottery kind of thing, but that an extra human agency is responsible for wonderful things. So this I called in my, actually it was my dissertation just a couple of years ago, that the enchanted worldview was one that was a belief in things more wonderful than probable. And by probable I mean odd statistics, rationalist reasoning, and so forth. And so the wonderful is more probable to them than the other self would suggest. So we have a case that the ideology of the discourse of a single unitary notion of self suggests a racial ideology, and that's a problem. The second problem is that it marginalizes the experience, I would say, of most of the people in the United States. And in that area, we have much to learn from those people as a dominant discourse, make that discourse dominant or at least co-equal. We also have to, I think, consider that, aside from the marginalization and the racialization, that the moral issues of lack of effort or inability at effort to remake oneself are also moral discourses that are part of this self-discourse, the unitary self-discourse. And so I think in conclusion, there's some of the things that, lo and behold, are already being done. Anne's work, for example, and some of Peter's work, and Stephen's work, is emphasizing not the cognitive rationalist, which I would say is of the referential self, but rather the expressive self, the self that is not bent on instrumental activities and productivity, but rather being rather than acting. And I think this is an essential difference in considering Alzheimer's patients, or anybody else actually, whether they're patients or not. And indeed, we could all be considered Alzheimer's patients in waiting if we live long enough. The anti-aging medicine takes hold. That we have a sort of a challenge to work toward allowing people to simply be rather than judging them by what they do. So being over doing. And a kind of Martin Buber thing, it's really and developing an I-thou relationship rather than simply an I relationship of Christopher Lash's The Age of Narcissism. So we need to emphasize community and community building and even smaller family building, recreating families, which some of and basing story groups do. They begin to create affective bonds among people and create a surrogate family. And we also should think about creating extended family, this is architectural work, extended families, family structures, borrowing some of the ideas from, say, West Africa or East Africa too, where there are compounds. So you have families living in different structures, but they can have common areas, common rooms where seniors could be cared for, so that they don't necessarily ever have to be extruded or, as someone said, surrendered, I think it was Anne again, surrendered to an institution where they're treated with great efficiency, but no care, concern, and individuality, no expressive relationships are developed. So, in conclusion, those are the three moral issues, but in the wider frame is that I argue there are two dominant cultural traditions, and only one is generally discussed in Alzheimer's discourse, and it is that the self of biomedicine and psychiatry as well. So that's it. I hope it wasn't too bumpy a ride because I didn't have the paper with me.
First, I'd like to apologize to Dr. Gaines. I'm mainly responsible for telling him that our paper session was tomorrow. Nothing like beginning a conference on Alzheimer's by forgetting when your paper is, I guess, but I am sorry for that. My paper is called Aging and Functional Health in the Biosocial Order. This presentation outlines some conceptual issues around aging and functional health in the biosocial order, and concludes with some thoughts and questions based on the other papers in this session. To begin, I think we can be grateful to Georges Caguilhem for his illumination that the normal and the pathological are more than two parts of a medical binary, but extend beyond the clinic and laboratory to encompass social and legal, political, and certainly moral values. And in Caguilhem's medical world, the normal and the pathological are predicated on a kind of body poised between culture and nature, with nature playing the role of a kind of ontological depth upon which culture builds its veneer. Today, several theorists present a very different picture. They observe that a growing set of genetic and reproductive and neurochemical and cognitive crises fostered by refined pharmaceutical interventions are remapping and even reversing the boundaries between the natural and the cultural, and the real and the artificial. Paul Rabinow has referred to this reversal as biosociality, where he says, and I quote, "Nature will become known and remade through technique and will finally become artificial, just as culture becomes natural." Similarly, Mike Featherstone and Mike Kepworth, the late Mike Kepworth, by the way, if you knew Mike, he passed away a little while ago, suggest that we live in an era where a series of natures overlap. The first being the bio, the second being the built, the third being the cyber, and the fourth nature, he says, is based in a post-anthropogenetic domain, or a post-human domain. There's also arguments by Nicholas Rose and others that biosocial technologies have sort of become the blueprints of life in general, because of their resonance with political and commercial rationalities geared to new regimes of health and lifestyle. Susan Squires also traced the literary and some of the cultural genealogies of post-human bodies and modes of reproduction related to biosociality. My colleague Barbara Marshall at Trent University and I have also looked at what effect the biosocial order has had on the normal and the pathological, which in our view has been absorbed and supplanted by a new binary between the functional and the dysfunctional. For us, the functional and the dysfunctional is a potent articulation of new biosocial values, of new standards of health, which have expanded the powers of expertise and the governance of everyday life to include a much broader horizon of human problems and disorders, especially non-infectious disorders without absolute causes or absolute cures. The ideas about functionality and the functional body go back as far as Aristotle's treatises on natural science, but it was Western medicine's organic and cellular probing that transformed physical function into a kind of universal calculus, a calculus with which to measure all activities of all living beings, of all of life itself. In this sense, Michel Foucault defines function, he says, as a constant middle term. He goes on to say it makes possible to relate together totalities of elements without the slightest visible identity. Sort of what Shakespeare says about money, which is it makes close impossibilities lie down and kiss. And the concept of dysfunction as well also made its appearance in early 20th century medical literature, much of it in relation to brain functioning. So there are important historical connections between the functional and the dysfunctional, and between the medical sciences and the economies of population productivity, having a healthy functional population, in industry, national preparedness in war, domestic preparedness and reproduction. And you can see the word function spread across a large spectrum of areas, from the cell to the nation. Even the CIA apparently is writing papers now using the word function when they talk about functioning countries and functioning nations, which I find kind of interesting. I wish to focus on three characteristics of the functional and dysfunctional binary central to current politics of health today. The first one is that functionality is primarily about measurement, because functional states are measurable states. They're quantifiable states. They are states relative to adjustment through technologies of enablement and enhancement. Normal states are usually viewed as states against which pathologies are deviations. Functional states can actually coexist with pathologies. One could be abnormal and functional quite easily at the same time, which is, what a lot of us are perhaps. Because functional states can be adjusted, they can be enabled, they can be enhanced by experiment and therapy and diet, lifestyle and drugs. And if we think of the spectrum disorders today, such as depression and attention deficit disorder and addictions and autism and sexual dysfunction, perhaps Alzheimer's disease, the approach to their management has been these means of technically adjusted function. A second aspect of the functional and dysfunctional states is that they are best represented by advanced informational technologies that stream individuals and groups across a data sphere, connecting expert literature and research studies, population statistics, and commercial marketing. There seems to be a wonderful flow and openness between these areas. Scanning, screening, mapping, imaging, coding, modeling, etc. are familiar means by which such connectivity is achieved. So the truth and the elegance of functional measurement is a product of the informational technologies that give it its beauty, that shape it and make it transparent in those cultural flows between bodies and individuals and peoples and populations. They're visible and translatable, they're alterable and open, and they're elegant and beautiful. Thirdly, the functional dysfunctional states and biosocial nature in general produce hierarchies of bio-identities, where individual status becomes rooted in somatic experience and tied to ethical and reflexive practices about who we are, based on somatic experience. So we have a kind of somatic status now that's just as important in some ways as class status, or ethnic status, or regional status. People come to know themselves according to the ways in which their biosocial lives have been judged to be worth living or not worth living. Indeed, in everyday worlds, the standards of functionality lead to magical ideals around endless fitness, and fitness is endless. There's no end to fitness. You can never be too fit. And if you bind that up with the dictates of consumer society, which people like Zygmunt Bauman have written about, he says we create an infinite scale of rapture, which casts on every experience a deep shadow of malfunction. And of course, there are also penalties for those who refuse to be forever functional and forever fit. So paradoxically, just as critical and feminist scholarship of the past 20 years has worked on debiologizing, de-essentializing the body, although as Susan's reminded me, feminist scholarship has taken up a far more nuanced scholarly approach to the biological body. But I would say, from my experience in teaching just popular sociology anyway, there is this kind of sense that we've won the battle between essentialism, the battle over essentialism on the body. And just as this has been considered kind of confirmed, the body has been renaturalized but under a very different set of conditions. And to illustrate this point, I want to briefly look at the example of the functional aging body. As this audience is aware, and as Professor Ballinger has also just talked about in his paper, conventional gerontology has mapped the aging process along well-defined chronological events, chronological transitions. And often these transitions, as we know, represent dominant developmental models, cultural models of the life course. In the latter 20th century, the life sciences, though, began to re-examine chronological age as an obstacle to research. Ironically, gerontology, which helped entrench chronological ages, was now turning its back on them because the concept, they said, lacked predictive value and lacked conceptual rigor. James Barron had a great quote about this. He says, "Chronological age is only an index, and unrelated sets of data show correlations with chronological age that have no intrinsic or causal relationship with each other. Thus, a goal of theory and research," and it's interesting that he says the goal of both theory and research, "has been to replace chronological age with variables that reflect the causes of change we initially identify as being closely related to chronological age." Other gerontologists, even before Barron, a fellow named I.M. Murray, a Canadian, in the 50s, and later Heron and Schoen in the 60s, had already started to work on a new age for age, a new age idea of functional age as a kind of articulation point for a series of multiple ages around the body. So we could have talk of a person who has the heart of a 20-year-old, the bones of a 40-year-old, the lungs of a 60-year-old, the sexual function of a 15-year-old, on, et cetera, on and on. We can disarticulate the body into a series of functions, and their functionality becomes the standard measurement by which we're concerned. The research also demonstrated that physiological and chronological ages vary relative to each other, producing in the end a measurable age based on functions, which all the researchers claim was also advantageous to life insurance companies, that just basing their tables on chronological age might be unprofitable. In 1963, the normative aging study that was conducted at the American Veterans Administrative Outpatient Clinic in Boston tried to use functional age in a practical longitudinal research setting. And the results were published in 1972 in a special issue of Aging and Human Development. The journal's editorial was entitled, "Is Functional Age Functional?" Which I thought was an interesting title because it poses functional age as an alternative to chronological age. And it asks, are we ready as a society to base age-related decisions upon scientific findings rather than tradition and expediency? The editor's response is in the affirmative, and the journal praises functional age as a great new unifying concept that also can include psychological age, feeling age, behavioral age, social age. It's a kind of endless sort of extendable metaphor. And while functional age has been criticized, there's a great professional enthusiasm that remains for it today because it has incredible potential to measure, standardize, and informate the aging body and its inventory of risks, in tune with neoliberal agendas of health promotion and individualistic, independent living programs as well, and the activity regime of the aging body that's been so prominent in gerontological thinking. And it also appears to transcend the limits of chronological age. In fact, it entrenches age into everything that can be measured, anything that can be called functional and dysfunctional. If you look at abstracts in social gerontology, which I use, which is a great set of abstracts of the research being done in gerontology for a snapshot of current research on aging, under functional states are a list of an extensive broad grouping of subheadings. Disability, environmental stressors, hearing loss, vision loss, urinary incontinence, environmental adaptability, sleep disorders, depression, communication disorders, risk of death, alcohol consumption, menopause, all forms of cognitive impairment, all kinds of racial and gender groupings, hospitalization, osteoporosis, levels of self-esteem, loneliness, pain, sexual health, smoking, and genetic differences. Every activity, in fact, however desperate, taking medication, shopping, sitting in a rocking chair, staring into space, is folded into activity regimes about functional health as one or dysfunctional health. Barbara Marshall and I have also written about aging and sexual function and dysfunction, where the terms are so prominent today, as a further example of how the biological has become an open zone of experimentation and optimized physical performance. That's another element of functionality, is its relation to performativity. It needs to be performed. It needs to be materialized. But I want to touch on what the functional-dysfunctional binary in the biosocial order might mean for Alzheimer's disease in terms of the papers presented just before me at this session. In the paper by Drs. Whitehouse and George, the question of discourse arises and how our narratives and our metaphors of Alzheimer's disease are framed. And in fact, how our very concepts of Alzheimer's disease are framed by metaphors, by the language we use to describe it, which is a really important point. And as their work and that of Professor Ballinger suggests, discourse is also a historical product. Hence, Alzheimer's disease, as an organic disease against which medical science and, as we saw, the sociologists of the self struggle, must also be examined for its metaphorical value, both as a disease and as a kind of cultural crisis, as Dr. Whitehouse told us, as a kind of war, along with all the other great wars in America right now, against terrorism, against drugs, against poverty, etc. The war metaphor seems to be incredibly political potent for some reason here. Drs. Whitehouse and George rightly argue for change, that new metaphors might help us change the perception and the treatment of the disease and expose the underlying reality that there are several paths for brain aging to travel, including dementia. New cultural stories are more inclusive, possibly, and in those places where they've been discussed and deployed, person-centered care has been more successful. In a narrative that pits the disease against the dying self, the caregiver against the care recipient, the body against the enfeebled and embattled mind, there is little room for alternative stories. So part of the problem, as I view it, is that brain metaphors have also changed. In the normal pathological discourse, the brain was a kind of locked natural organ, an object of science and science fiction that could be crudely mapped as a kind of neurological landscape within the skull. And we have craniometry, we have great interesting traditions of mapping the brain. Today the brain seems to be more of an open biosocial laboratory in which human attributes are molecularized, functionalized, compressed, including things like addictions, desire, creativity, violence, and even love. We're looking for these things now in the brain. And as Nicholas Rose claims, when mind seems visible within the brain, the space between person and organ flattens out. Mind then becomes what brain does. Memory has also been compressed into the brain. And some of Anne Basting's work talks about this. And memory is turned into also a matter of functional performance. So a new story of Alzheimer's also has to consider a critique of what the brain has become in the biosocial order. A new story needs to disarticulate the compression of personhood in the brain and redistribute it across the range of human experience. The medical answer to Alzheimer's might be to manage the brain, might be to find new pharma products to enhance memory and enable function. But the question is not only what kinds of products fit and manage the brain, but what kinds of brains do pharmaceutical companies need to manage brains? What's their role in figuring and configuring personhood in the brain? Dr. Gaines in his paper presents us with another really important here, a comparative exercise in which to examine other kinds of cells and ways of being a person. to inspire us to question our own conceptualization of Alzheimer's disease. The dominant Western and white person, typically imagined along the lines of the liberal individual, is an assemblage of human regions, including rationality, agency, memory, the psyche, the brain, and the soul. As other anthropologists have demonstrated, this particular assemblage is a product of culture. And as Dr. Gaines demonstrates, different cultures can assume different identities, cross-cut by how disorders such as Alzheimer's are registered within that kind of cultural person and treated. So on the one hand, here and in his larger work, the fact that the Protestant indexical self and the Catholic referential self seem to create different experiences, different meanings of Alzheimer's, this is a crucial indication of how other cultures might operate in that space between the self and disease. On the other hand, this exercise also gives us the opportunity to question, and I think we should, the status of Western personhood itself, and ask why certain regions have now become the guarantor of the self, the guarantor of the self. Why have they become the seat of consciousness, especially memory? Something Ian Hacking tackles somewhat in his book called Rewriting the Soul. And this goes back to Professor Ballinger's mention of George Miller Beard as well, whereby the problematizing of memory becomes, as the guarantor of the truth of the moral self and legal issues, becomes an interesting crack in types of selves and types of selfhood there in the 19th century. Both these papers then ask us to revisit the notion of a coherent selfhood via a detour through critical approaches to Alzheimer's disease. My contribution to these presentations is to suggest that we also critically consider the enhanced role of the functional brain in the biosocial order, in all of its celebrated discoveries, alongside the call for new metaphors of inclusion and stories of hope. Thanks.
We have time for questioning, and I'm happy to field questions. And we have a mic that we're going to have to hand around to people on the web, right? So.
Thanks. Peter, I wanted to ask you a question to just talk about, if you would. In one of the slides you presented, you look at the variability. And yet, when we do drug trials, when we do any kinds of, looking at any kind of outcome measure, it seems as though there's a great motivation to get rid of variability so as to prove the point. So do you see a fundamental conflict of interest going on here in sort of distorting reality as a result? Does that make any sense?
It does. I wish I knew what reality was so I could figure out if we distort it. But yeah, well, I think, human beings look at an enormously complicated world that's very variable, and we try to categorize things, and doctors are a sub-classification of that kind of behavior. So it's well motivated. We want to find the kind of mild cognitive impairment that will respond to a medication. The problem is there's so much heterogeneity that we've done analyses across different expert groups and different drug studies, and the variability is considerable. We will continue meeting in wonderful resorts, I can assure you, trying to figure out if we can characterize this variability. But people are getting a bit frustrated with it, and I think they haven't. What I refer to mild cognitive impairment as is auto-deconstructing Alzheimer's, because the reason they can't figure out mild cognitive impairment is they've got the wrong model for Alzheimer's. But the empirical evidence is that if you try to create a category where you use the same test to define mild cognitive in the same ways, if you can get agreement around that, even when you do that, there's still an enormous amount of variability. There is a form of mild cognitive impairment, which is the amnestic form. And this is, of course, the march to progress. We now have multiple kinds of mild cognitive impairment, which does appear to respond more to cholinesterase inhibitors and probably in people who are ApoE44. So I'm speaking a little bit against myself, because those people probably do respond more to the drugs that we use to treat Alzheimer's. That's probably because they have a more form fruste of Alzheimer's disease with the cholinergic pathology I showed. So it's not a hopeless task, but it is far more complicated than the war metaphor would suggest.
Listening to all these learned professors and doctors and medical people, of which I am not, the question in my mind, has Alzheimer's really become the generic term for senility? And from listening to particularly Dr. Whitehouse saying there are various forms of cognitive impairment, and they're being called Alzheimer's, of which he is stating that they're not, is more or less, and it's this other form of cognitive impairment. And does the general public and the consumer, shall we say, have to become more educated in that way of thinking, that it's really something else other than this generic term of what it used to be?
I don't want to hog the response, but I do want to mention Oprah Winfrey, because it's the way to sell a lot of books. And I was on the Oprah Winfrey show back 20 years ago, and she asked me 3 times in different ways, what's the difference between Alzheimer's and senility? And I gave her the Bob Butler kind of response. Well, senility is a vague term. We don't know if it means normal or a disease. It's something that the proverbial intelligent layperson, of which you are one, and you're asking the very important question, would use, but doctors don't want to, because that's your term, and we want the term Alzheimer's disease, because we think if we get a term like Alzheimer's disease, we'll be able to fix the problem. Well, 20 years later, I want to get back on the show and say, Oprah, you asked me that question, 25 years ago, and as a bright young assistant professor at Hopkins, I thought I had the answers. Well, I've written this book, which you might want to put in your book club, called The Myth of Alzheimer's, which basically says that senility is, it's another word. Every word is loaded with different kinds of concepts and terms and politics, but that's kind of what I'm saying. In fact, I wanted to write a paper on the molecular biology of senility.
I have a couple of sort of short comments, if that's acceptable. First to Peter. I was talking, this is not the best way to start this off, but I was talking to Ron Peterson the other day at the Mayo Clinic, and he is actually now in a position where he states very firmly that mild cognitive impairment is just this interim category that he has created. He says the time is not quite ready for disposing of this yet, but he's going to bury it in a relatively short period of time as far as he's concerned, and he will bury it when the biomarkers are brought to light and we can dispense with all of this psychoneurological testing and really move to the hard stuff. And that is a wonderful, beautiful, nice man though he is. This is what he invests in very, very strongly. And so this is another form of the kind of stuff that Nicholas Rose has been writing about, the somatized self, which is being created as a result of this neo-reductionism to the brain. So the brain is actually not being released into larger spheres much at all. It's being very firmly kept inside the cranium and actually inside smaller particles than that, very, very firmly. So I just wondered what your comment was on that.
I think, as Eric said, Alzheimer, got famous because he was creating brain images. We are spending enormous amounts of money on biomarkers, and to me it's a false attempt to try to make things more precise and objective. And so I don't think that funeral will occur if he's waiting for that. The only way that funeral will occur, and this is a huge conceptual problem for people who've invested their careers in this, is for people to take another look at Alzheimer's.
Yes, it's just...
Can I just say one quick thing? It seems that a lot of the diseases of our time have pre-phases, happen in phases, and there's earlier and earlier phases. In our own work on sexual dysfunction, we have pre-ED, erectile disorders, erectile dysfunction, etc. And it's interesting how it's brought down. You have it once a disease category enters what I'm considering this functional, dysfunctional world, how it becomes increasingly easier to bring it forward and look at early phases, early stages, early warnings, early detections, and how it's increasingly up to the person also to be ever vigilant about the earliness of certain things. So I think there is something, it's not surprised about early cognitive impairment being.
And of course, genetic markers are supposed to will be the next one to tighten this up, this early ability, we assume, to be able to predict who is at risk and who should be taking care very, very early on. But I did have a good question of a very different sort, which is to do with your comment that memory becomes the guarantor of self in our westernized white version, Caucasian version of the self. That is indeed the case in many ways, but I think it is actually less so than in non-literate societies, where if the memory goes, then you really are in very deep water, because there are no written sources and no written statements, and people with good memories become the leaders of non-literate societies and remain so as long as their memories are good. Now, obviously, people everywhere have all these other means of other selves, other forms of self, other means of staying as part of the social unit through music and dance and storytelling. But when your entire history depends on human memory, it takes on a very, very prominent significance.
Do you want to respond to that as an answer all of this?
Well, actually, I wanted to respond to what you were saying earlier, just before Margaret's question, and that is to point out that whenever in the West, whenever the dominant ideology, whenever something is distinguished, a condition like Alzheimer's, you can simply wait for the pre and post to come to develop, because everything has to be in threes. You have to have a beginning, a middle, and an end, and it's just not complete. And we think that with stories have to have a beginning, a middle, and an end. When a famous writer whose name I've just forgotten, Kurt Vonnegut, was that case, he was talking about this in another connection, but he said he actually has an MA in anthropology, Kurt Vonnegut, and he said, but when you read Native American stories, they don't have beginnings, middles, and ends. They just sort of going along. And he says, that's not a good story. You can have a beginning, a middle, and an end. So it's really sort of our literary kind of tradition to have a beginning. So if you have Alzheimer's, then you have to have a pre-Alzheimer's, and then a late stage, and so forth. So we tend to stage everything.
I'm interested in exploring a theme that was sort of going across the three of what you were saying, and triggered by another word you used, which was consumer. It feels like in the shaping of the individual who is in possession of their faculties, that sense of the possessive individual, that is coming in context and conflict with sort of the designing of the market of what you can purchase to stay functional and stay in possession of your faculties as the consumer and the possessive individual. There was a study that I actually read, and it's Cuddy. I don't know if it's the same Cuddy that Jacqueline was referring to before, but it was about stereotypes about aging across cultures. And the hypothesis was actually that the stereotypes we have in Western concepts of self, and thank you for sort of making those into selves, is that the stereotypes showed we think of older people as warm but incompetent. Next only to the percentages were closest to, the term they used were retarded people in that paper. And then they did the studies from Asian cultures that they considered more collective, and it was exactly the same results. And with the concept being, the concept of their conclusions were that it was the economic environment, that globalization is sharing this lovely thing across the world. I know it's an interesting think particularly for Margaret. And I just wonder about the comments about consumerism as a model for looking at this as well.
Well, I'll take part of that. I think actually that the consumerism as a model is a gloss for what I mentioned and what Jess mentioned too, and that is, and Steve mentioned, the responsibility of individuals, which I see as an extension of the notion of the self as being in control. Responsibility of recognizing symptoms early, responsibility for doing something about it, and so forth. So in that sense, you have to be a consumer because you have to consume the knowledge and the techniques of rectifying, of remaking, or preventing the unmaking of the self.
I think there's aging, and we always want to put an adjective in front of aging, and the one you hear most is successful aging or productive aging. There's kind of a counter movement around conscious aging and other things, but I do think that this conflict of interest between, the medical profession has been commodified incredibly. I think that's the problem with our world in general, that we are, we're putting, function is defined by measuring it, and measuring it by money is the easiest way to do it. So I do think that the economics, and that's why these ecological models are valuable to me, because we cannot keep on consuming. So Alzheimer's is deeply connected to some of these other real challenges we face about how we think about our world. There's a book just recently written by Bill McGibbon called Deep Economy, which kind of fills up on deep ecology, to rethink the very way we constitute consumption and production in our world.
I was just going to add that there's been a lot written and a lot of concerns about the consumer self, that in current healthcare systems in Western industrialized countries create a certain kind of self that, unlike the past, let's say, stereotype about the person in medical systems where it was a big bad state oppressing victimized others and marginalized populations and individuals. Now the individual is kind of invited in very specific ways to partner with their own care, and to, of course, take a large part in active care. Only certain individuals who are literate, who are health literate in a way, have the cultural capital, gain through that kind of privilege. And all the stories I've heard of, you put in a helpline in an underprivileged area with a 1-800 number as a way of inviting people to take care of themselves. Kind of ridiculous techniques, Press 1 if you swallowed a safety pin. Press 2 if you poisoned yourself by accident. Press 3 if your foot is bleeding. But the sense that you should be familiar enough with your own self, your own care, health literacy, and ways of self-rating your care too, that bring you into the system. The other concern is how globalized is that becoming as healthcare systems sort of become globalized. Lawrence Cohen's written this book, No Aging in India, in fact. That looks at this kind of problem. How do we go from no aging to aging because of the export of Western professional discourses and medical systems? So I think we should be asking that question too. Is there a globalized healthy self that's being that's part of the general problem today?
Okay. I want to pose a challenge. I think all of us who are kind of trying to reshape the way we're thinking about dementia, and kind of anticipating when some folks involved in direct interventions, although Peter, certainly your work is involved with that. And that is, my concern is that this is kind of a discourse of the privileged. This critique is something that is really class-centered. We're all in a pretty similar position on a scale of privilege. If you look at some of the really powerful interventions that I know we heard some about last night, there's concern about what kind of institutions are able to implement those sort of things, what kind of people are in those institutions. So how do we escape, this, if sort of if we're about getting past loss and sort of embracing expressivity, emotional, and so forth. These are sort of leisure sort of discourses. These are things available to a privileged class. how do we, deal with this problem? So, I don't know if that's a question, but there you go.
You mean aside from revolution?
I think we celebrate what the African American community does for people with dementia. They keep them in the bosom of the family. There's a reason Oprah Winfrey asked me that question. She is doing her job reflecting her community. They see aging more as a part of dementia, senility, more as a part of normal aging, and they don't as much put their relatives in nursing homes. So, I think the first thing to do is to say, what can we learn from people who have not accepted our dominant views? Because I think there's some wisdom in that.
That was part of the point of my paper, is that there's actually, I think, numerically a majority group that their view is ignored. So they think that the family's members should essentially age in place and not be surrendered to an institution. And so, as Peter's reflecting, there are various communities, Latino communities, the same way, that they need some tools to be able to manage better at home and keeping people in the family, rather than having them surrendered to a sort of faceless, bureaucratic, poorly built institutionals, both in terms of physical structure and social structure.
Just quickly, I agree. I think there's a kind of middle-class ideal that assumes that universal entitlements are assumed by everybody. And so now these new kinds of entitlements we're talking about, the title dignity, dying with dignity, aging in place, being cared for throughout the life course with sensitivity, etc., is a kind of entitlement as well. That does have a kind of middle-class, culturally capitalized sort of background. And if you talk to healthcare workers I've talked to, they have 15 people to take care of, change beds for, they're spit on, barfed on, stuff's thrown at them. It's really kind of hard to say, well, we have to treat these people with dignity and respect too. And they do, and it's a hard job. But we forget that part of it. So there's a political economics behind care, and a number of contexts to do with class, social status, and regionalism that we still have to bring in to our discussion of entitlements, just as we did with the entitlement to disability care or unemployment insurance or any of the other things against which there's a real war on in the United States, in fact. So the irony is America is making a war on real entitlements and benefits at the same time it's proclaiming new universal ones.
We have a break until 1:45 for panelists. We'll have lunch here. It's lunch on your own for those who aren't part of the conference presenters. And let's thank the speakers.
Thank you.
He should have another shot. Really.
Well done.
That was great.
He should have another opportunity.